So welcome everybody to the Dialogue of Americas. I have the honor to be joined by Professor Thomas Davidson. So Thomas, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you for inviting me to participate. My name is Thomas Davidson. I'm currently an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey in the United States. And my research focuses on how political parties, social movements, and other actors are using social media platforms, as well as the technologies being developed to do automated content moderation, specifically to detect hate speech on social media platforms.
That's perfect. So you mentioned content moderation, right? So what do you understand by content moderation, and what is the role of data sets, artificial intelligence, machine learning process? Can you walk us through all of that?
Yeah. So content moderation is this practice that social media companies and other websites have been continually developing really since they've been operating to control the type of content that users are producing and sharing on these websites. And so, for example, in the case of Facebook and Twitter, it might be determining which images, which types of links, which types of text are appropriate or inappropriate on their platform. For news websites, for example, they might not want people listing illegal goods on their website. And so that would still, I would consider that a form of content moderation. Now, what's the role of machine learning and artificial intelligence in this process? Well, the challenge of doing content moderation on today's social media platforms and websites is that these platforms have enormous numbers of users. And so, for example, Facebook has over 2 billion users, I think now. And so that means that you have hundreds of millions of items of content being produced probably every hour by these users. And so it's just not something that any human content moderator is able to look at. In the early days of the internet, it might have been the case that each post could be manually reviewed by a human content moderator, and they could decide whether or not something should be posted or not. But with this huge volume of content, social media platforms and other websites have turned to machine learning and artificial intelligence to try to develop automatic ways of doing content moderation.
Perfect, thank you so much. And you actually wrote a paper about that, right? It's called Racial Bias in Hate Speech and Abusive Language Detection Datasets. Can you tell us a little bit about your findings? You said you work on political issues and democracy and elections. So can you also kind of relate how all of those issues actually is impacting our democratic debate, our public space, right, for discussion?
So I think it might be useful to start by telling you a little about my research in hate speech in this area. And so I became interested in this problem of how can we detect hate speech on social media as I was studying far-right groups in Europe and how these groups were operating on platforms like Facebook and getting huge amounts of attention from the public. And one of the challenges of social media companies is determining if they have content that's considered to be hate speech, how can they detect this type of hate speech at scale and prevent it from occurring on the platform, either by removing the content, by banning the users, by making the content so it just kind of doesn't appear. There are different policy interventions one can choose, but you need a way to actually determine what constitutes hate speech in the first place. And what I found when I started working on this topic about 5 or 6 years ago now, is there's a lot of the work that was being done by computer scientists tended to be overly simplistic, that they would say the presence or absence of a single word, like a certain hateful term, indicates whether or not something is hateful or not hateful. And what we found is there's a lot of the content that was being flagged as hateful by these kinds of algorithms was actually quite innocuous. It was often content where people might use a word that might be a slur in one context, but they were using it in a very different context where a sort of reasonable observer would never consider that content to be hateful. And so what we worked on in some of our early work in this area is trying to develop an algorithm that could distinguish between language that may be offensive, may contain certain curse words or slurs, and language that's actually hate speech. So language that's targeting certain groups and is potentially directing violence towards those groups, or is drawing upon some sort of protected category like disability status or sexuality or race or ethnicity, and is using that category as something negative towards that group. And so we showed that this is something that you can do, and that having these more types of nuanced classifications can actually help to improve these types of systems for detecting hate speech. Now, what we showed in the subsequent paper, the one you mentioned, is that many of these different systems, and so in that paper, we took several different data sets which had been created by researchers as a way to train algorithms to detect hate speech. And what we found is that almost across the board, these algorithms tended to flag language used by African-American Twitter users as potentially more hateful, more offensive, more abusive than language used by white Twitter users. And this is based on the determination of the user's race is based on another model, so it's kind of imperfect, but what we think of as the language used by African-American and white Twitter users. And so what this means is that these types of systems are potentially going to be biased against the same groups that they're actually designed to protect, right? So if you think about the context of the United States, we might want to have companies like Facebook and Twitter having content moderation systems where they can detect hate speech against African Americans and proactively remove that content to reduce the harm towards that community of this type of hate speech. And these systems were actually potentially detecting language used by African Americans and disproportionately classifying that as hate speech itself. And so the implications for democracy here are that you might have certain minority groups where their language and their expressions online are actually being over-policed by these types of algorithmic systems. And so it's worth emphasizing here that this isn't necessarily due to any malintent from the people who created these systems. It's really a function of the way that the data that make up these systems is collected. And in this case, we think that the data collected was oversampling African-American users of Twitter. So they were overrepresented in the data that was going into these machine learning models. And also it's potentially caused by bias at the annotation stage. So when you have a machine learning model that detects hate speech, what it's really doing is it's using a set of human classifications where we show it several thousand examples where humans have determined whether or not something should be considered hate speech. And then the machine is effectively learning from these human examples to then apply to other examples out there. And so it's possible that there are human biases that the people who made these examples perhaps tended to consider some of the language used by African Americans as more hateful, that then become internalized into the model itself. And then it potentially amplifies and reifies these human biases. And so the real danger is that we have content moderation systems that kind of inherit the existing social biases and then reproduce those potentially at a very large scale.
That's extremely interesting. So there is a lot of discussion on equality and representation in data sets, but this actually goes beyond that. It's not that perhaps the data set itself is the problem, but also who actually organize that information or tags that information, right? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and I think that also takes us to the discussion of workforce representativeness, right? Yeah. And all these issues.
So one of the examples we looked at in our paper was actually a data set where the people who were doing the annotation were self-declared feminists, and they were determining whether certain tweets were sexist or not sexist. And still we found this bias in this data set. So it's something that still needs more research, but it's not necessarily clear that even if we have the right people, potentially that these biases go away. There's some experimental evidence that does show that making people aware of these types of issues prior to them doing the annotation might reduce downstream bias. So if you tell the people doing the annotation, you should be very sensitive to the way that people are using language, and it's possible that people from different groups use language in a different way. If you make that clear to them, then it may actually reduce the type of bias that these models learn. And so there are some interventions that can help here, but we're still at a very early stage of understanding this, at least in the academic research. Now, in terms of the workforce, I think as members of the public, we simply don't know what the composition of the workforce is that these large social media platforms are using to build these types of data sets that they use to train their internal models. So a company like Twitter will have sets of machine learning models, and these will be based on data that Twitter itself is annotating from either people proactively reporting it to Twitter or their own internal experiments. And we simply don't know who's doing this work and who the humans are that are helping to train these machines. There's certainly been some critique of AI labs and this type of research where it disproportionately is males and white and Asian males, at least in the United States, working on these types of systems. And so there's evidence that things like facial recognition technology is less accurate at detecting the faces of people with darker skin, and in particular the faces of Black women. In part, many have argued because Black women are simply not represented on the teams that are building these technology. And so they don't necessarily think to include people with a variety of different skin tones or appearances in the training data they're using to train these types of models. So there's certainly a representation issue, but unfortunately, from the outside, we really don't know how this plays out within websites and social media companies.
Exactly. Thank you so much. How have you observed these issues regarding other vulnerable populations through your work?
Yeah, so one of the issues that we draw attention to in our work is this problem of false positives, where someone might say something that we shouldn't really consider to be hate speech, and yet the machine detects this and considers it hate speech. So another example here would be sexual minorities, that you have people from the LGBT community using certain terms in their online language. So they might use a word like queer, and for them, queer is an identity of empowerment. And the problem is as a hurtful term. And so what ends up happening is...
Sorry, I think I had a problem with my internet. You said that it stopped on queer. Can you move from?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, for example, members of LGBT groups will use the word queer in online discussions. And for them, it's considered to be an identity term. It's potentially a term of empowerment, and it doesn't have this negative connotation. But if you have a model that's trained on language taken from, for example, Twitter, it's possible that some Twitter users use the word queer in a negative context, and they use it as a slur and as an insult. And so what will end up happening is that the language used by members of this community to potentially describe themselves gets flagged as being hate speech because of this association that these models have learned. And so in my work, I mostly focus on how this affects African-American communities in the United States, but there's certainly evidence that this occurs in a gendered way, that it occurs in the context of sexual minorities and potentially other racial and ethnic groups. But the academic research on this topic is still at a very early stage. I think the important thing to consider here is when you think about large social media platforms, they're operating across the world in many, many different contexts. And so the types of models they're using for their automated content moderation have to scale up to many different languages and many contexts. And so it's likely that if we picked different countries and looked at different languages and looked at different dialects within these countries, that we may see the same types of problems occurring, that these models might be systematically biased in favor of certain ethnic groups, certain languages, or certain dialects. And so lots more research needs to be done to kind of understand this at a global scale. I think the most famous example of this is the case of Myanmar and how Facebook was used in Myanmar to incite genocide against the Rohingya Muslim minority. And one of the arguments that Facebook tried to make to sort of absolve themselves of responsibility here was, well, we didn't have people who spoke the language working at Facebook. And so they simply didn't have enough people who spoke Burmese, let alone any other local dialects and regional languages, to actually do the human content moderation that's necessary as a first step to scale it up in an automated way. And so I expect that these problems are occurring in many, many different contexts, and we just simply don't know about them at this stage.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there were a lot of examples coming out of Brazil and from photography and issues of nudity and things like that. So that's was again, right, outside the Brazilian context that had a completely different meaning, right? And
right.
Imagine in the Americas, right? We have so many languages and different cultures within countries. So I think a final question here is, how do you see all that affecting human rights or civil rights, right? Are these communities end up being less represented in the internet because their speech is being moderated, right?
Yeah. So I think the danger here is that we have groups which are already repressed in society, that then these technological systems end up potentially exacerbating and perpetuating the repression of these groups. Now, I think that for oppressed groups, social media can be extremely powerful. It can be a way that people can spread information and get the word out and reach, for example, news organizations or connect with transnational activist networks. And these technologies have the capacity to be very, very empowering, right? We're seeing right now in Cuba that Cuban activists who just have the internet has opened up much more in the last several years in Cuba, and they're actually able to send videos to people in the United States and in other countries and directly show the repression that's occurring on the ground in the country. So there's, I think, huge potential for empowerment. The danger is that these same platforms are repressing certain types of speech or certain types of content. And so to take this Cuban example further, what happens if the Cuban government says to Facebook, we want you to take down this content or not show certain terms, certain words on social media? And so, it's really the relationship between these platforms and state governments that's going to, I think, dictate how these content moderation policies really affect people's human rights in a direct way. I know Cuba is probably not so good an example here because I think Facebook doesn't officially operate within Cuba, and I doubt it has any. I think it's actually blocked from Cuba. You can't access it unless you use a VPN. But the danger is that other countries and states are going to put pressure on platforms to incorporate their view of, what's acceptable conduct and speech into how these platforms do content moderation. And in some cases, I think we can think of acceptable examples. So in Germany, for example, they have very strict laws about certain types of hate speech. And so, for example, Nazi content and any content that glorified the Nazi party is completely banned in Germany.
And the same in Brazil and various Latin American countries.
Right. And so there's pressure on these social media platforms to adhere to the local laws of the country. The danger is what happens if we consider a country to be an oppressive regime, and we then these social media platforms become kind of implicated in the repression.
Yeah. Any final thoughts or any hopes for this dialogue, or have you seen any good news out there or good practices that we could look deeper into?
Yeah, so I'm optimistic in the sense that I think these systems are getting much better, and there's a lot of pressure on platforms to be sensitive to the kinds of issues that have come up in my research. And so, for example, Twitter now is doing some internal evaluations of their systems to detect bias, partly in response to the users of the platform who are complaining about issues of bias. For example, they had an algorithm that would automatically crop pictures in the Twitter newsfeed, and it tended to crop out people with darker skin at a higher rate to people with lighter skin. And so they did an internal audit. And so it's good to see that there's more attention to these issues. And also the technology is advancing in a way that allows these systems to perhaps become improved. But I think the most important thing is we still need some humans in the loop to evaluate and make sure that these systems are functioning as they should. And we really need transparency. So as a researcher, it's very hard for me to get very good data on these types of issues to be able to measure the prevalence out there in the world. So a lot of my work on hate speech detection has been kind of replicating these types of systems in the lab in a way that approximates perhaps how it's working in major platforms or websites, but we don't really know exactly what's going on inside. And I think the most important thing right now, from my perspective as a researcher, is to advocate for greater transparency, greater data sharing, and for these companies to really open up about how they're doing content moderation and to really show their users why certain items of content are considered to be acceptable or unacceptable.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thomas. This was incredibly eye-opening, and thank you so much for all your research. We hope to see more of your research coming out. It's so relevant, not just for the US. And that's all.